Okay, live stream is starting up. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cosmos Society Online Open House series, brought to you by the Harvard University Center for Hellenic Studies. I'm your host, Keith the Stone, and I'm very happy to welcome today as our guest Miriam Kamil, who is a fifth-year PhD candidate in classical philology at Harvard University. She's working on a dissertation on the literary tradition of the Furies, as adapted by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, under the tutelage of Richard Thomas, Greg Nage, and Richard Tarrant. And I would like to add that Miriam is also a treasured colleague in the context of Greg Nage's Harvard College Heroes course, where we worked together for a couple of years. And Miriam will be talking with us today about Ovid's Cecropids and an Attic Aetiology. Before I let you take it away, I wonder whether, as you begin, you'd be willing to share with us a bit about the origins of your interest in the ancient Roman world.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for being here. I am a Latinist here in this conference by the Center for Hellenic Studies, so I appreciate your welcoming me. So my interest in Roman studies, and in Ovid in particular, has been developing over the past maybe 10 years as I've been in college and in graduate school. And I've always been particularly interested in monsters. I just find them really fun and delightful. I think a lot of people do. So the Furies have become the focus of my dissertation. And there are a handful of scenes in the Metamorphoses that could be construed as scenes depicting Furies. And I'm going to be talking about one of them today. But rather than focusing on the Fury, I'm sort of talking about everything that's going on around it. This was sort of part of my goal to really understand this scene in and out before I dive into the fundamental part of the Furies for my dissertation. Does that answer the question?
It does. It's wonderful.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, take it away. And whenever you want the images, just let us know.
Great. Yeah, I think it would be fine to pull up the PowerPoint even now. My title is Ovid's Cecropids and an Attic Aetiology, looking particularly at the lines listed in book 2 of the Metamorphoses. So this is sometimes called the Attic cycle in the Metamorphoses, where we talk about the foundational myths of Athens. And the Cecropids are the daughters of the foundational king of Athens called Cecrops. So he's got 3 daughters, and I'll get into all of that. So the myth of the Cecropids is attested in a number of ancient sources. By the time Ovid published his Metamorphoses in the early years of the 1st century CE, he had a number of variants to work with. Nevertheless, it seems that Ovid presents a myth with some unprecedented details, replacing its usual tragic ending with an unusual love story. In the midst of these events, we're presented with the only Athenian festival in the poem, the identification of which has never been agreed upon. In this paper, I examine the myths of the daughters of Cecrops as they are attested outside of Ovid's work before turning to the Ovidian adaptation. Balancing all the evidence and weighing up the arguments of other scholars, I'll then attempt to identify the festival we see in Metamorphoses Book 2 with consideration of its function within the larger work. So the myth of the Cecropids begins roughly as follows. Cecrops was the autochthonous, so born from the earth, founder of Athens. As a sign of his autochthony, he's frequently depicted as part man, part snake. Snakes are consistently associated with the earth, with the underworld, and Cecrops' autochthonous identity was precious to the Athenians of the historical period who felt a deep bond with their city. And I think we can go to the next slide on the PowerPoint, which will have an image. There's Earth handing over a baby to Athena, while Cecrops is the half snake guy nearby. So Cecrops has 3 daughters in myth, and their names are Aglaros, Pandrosos, and Herse. While he's ruling Athens, there's a sort of divine burlesque scene in the myth where the god Hephaestus attempts to rape Athena. Athena, an avowed virgin goddess, fights him off. He ejaculates on her thigh. She wipes this off with a bit of wool and tosses it on the ground. Since gods are invariably fertile, the scrap of wool causes the earth to become impregnated and another autochthonous leader is born. This is the hero Erichthonius, who is the baby we see in this image, and he'll grow up to found the great Panathenaia festival in Athens. Erichthonius appears frequently on ancient vases at the remarkable moment of his birth. We see that the larger woman there represents Earth itself, handing off the baby to his ward, Athena. And despite not being his mother, Athena takes the leading role in raising the baby. As part of these duties, she hands off the baby, concealed in a basket, to the three princess Cecropids, but with a stern warning not to look inside. In some variants, two sisters look inside the basket, Aglaros and Herse. As we'll see, Ovid either invented or opted for a variant where only Aglaros transgresses the goddess's order. Erichthonius sometimes looks like a normal baby, like in this image. Often he's surrounded by two snakes, a detail which is explained in Euripides' Ion as an ideology for the Athenian royal family, placing protective and decorative golden snakes in their baby baskets. Sometimes, though, Erichthonius is monstrous, like Cadmus, half snake, half human, or sometimes entirely snake. And I think we can go to the next slide here. So there we see Erichthonius in the basket with two sort of protective snakes around him, and there's Athena next to him, and over to the right is the princess looking at him, transgressing the order. And sometimes he's just a straight up snake, which we'll see in the next slide. And this demonstrates what happens in the next part of the myth, where the girls, having seen the monstrous baby, lose their minds, run away from it, and jump off a cliff and die. So at this point, I'd like to pause for a brief meditation on etymology. It's been suggested that two of the three sisters' names are derived from a word meaning dew. Herse is a Greek noun that means dew, raindrops, or liquid. Pandrosis means the all dewy one, from the noun drosos, which means dew or clear water. Agloros, ever the odd one out, is a bit more cryptic. The name may be related to the adjective aglaos, meaning bright or shining, and sometimes used to describe the shimmer of water. There's evidence that the name was originally agraulos, which could have a connection with fields, in which case the connection with dew is maybe harder to see. But regardless of Aglaros' name, dew is an important element in this myth in other ways. In Callimachus's fragmentary epic Hecale, the myth is recounted with Hephaestus' semen described as dew, drosos. There seems to be a metonymic connection between dew on the earth, which produces fruit, and human reproduction, where quote unquote dew yields a child. As an extension of this metonymy, people have frequently discussed the myth of the Cecropids in relation to phallic symbolism. As in this face painting here, we can extrapolate from the story a young girl's primal fear of her first sexual encounter. Considering that in ancient Athens, girls were often married as teenagers to older men, the idea of this fear recurring in myth is not out of the question. As we'll see, Ovid retains notions of sex and marriage in his adapted version of the myth in a novel way. So all of this leads me to the festival of the Auriphoria. When the Cecropids die, they set a precedent for observing mysteries outside of a ritual context. We can think of Pentheus in Euripides' Bacchae, whose punishment for spying on Bacchic rituals outside of the proper context is to be torn limb from limb by his mother and aunts. The secret rituals of mystery cults must remain a secret to the uninitiated. So when Aglaros looks at the contents of Athena's basket, she transgresses this fundamental rule and dies. The mythic transgression has a ritual counterpart in the Athenian festival of the Auriphoria. This festival is best described by Pausanias, who seems to find it delightfully obscure. And I have his passage on the next slide. So he says, "The things about this that most of all cause wonder for me are not completely knowable, but I will write down the kinds of things that take place. Two maidens dwell not far from the temple of Athena Polias. The Athenians call them Auriphoroi. For a time, they live a regulated life at the place of the goddess, but when the festival comes round, they ritually perform at night the following. They place on their heads what the priestess of Athena gives them to carry. Neither she who gives it knows what it is that she is giving, nor do they who carry it understand what it is. Now there is an enclosure in the city, the enclosure of Aphrodite in the gardens, as she is called. It is not far away, and there is an underground descending passage that goes through it. This descending passage is not artificial, but natural. By way of this passage, the maidens descend, and down below, they leave behind the things they were carrying, and they take something else, which they bring back, something that is covered. These maidens after this are dismissed, and then there are other maidens led up to the Acropolis as replacements for them." Pausanias tells us about this festival not long after relaying the Erichthonius myth and immediately after describing the shrine of Pandrosis on the Acropolis. Pausanias emphasizes the unknown burdens the girls carry. Where Aglaros failed and peeked at the mystery, the Parthenoi who participate in the Auriphoria keep the secrets covered, thereby ritually correcting the mistake made in the myth. In keeping with this interpretation, one etymological theory about the name of the festival, Auriphoria, is a combination of the words meaning to bear, pharaoh, and a word aureta, which means things that cannot be spoken. So things which can't be looked at also can't be spoken. So we see the combination of the myth and the ritual in the name. One version of this myth comes from the fragmentary epic Hecale, which I mentioned of Callimachus. In the Hecale, the Athenian hero Theseus stays at the house of an old woman on his way to slay the Marathon bull. It's ultimately the foundation story for the Attic deme that Theseus names Hecale after the old woman. It is typically Callimachian to eschew the epic scene of a monster battle, the Marathon bull, in favor of a focus on everyday life. Likewise, Callimachian is the apparently lengthy transgression in the tale where a crow and an owl chat outside of the house. Though sparse, the lines we have from Callimachus's epic show a clear intertextual relationship with Ovid's version of the Cecropids tale. And I'll use the Callimachian precedent as a lead-in to the Ovidian passages I now want to discuss. Like Callimachus, Ovid puts the story of the Cecropids and Erichthonius in the mouth of a crow, one of the many internal narrators in the Metamorphoses. Both Callimachus and Ovid use the story to reveal an unrelated ideology, the story of why owls are associated with Athena. Both Callimachus and Ovid's crows tell the story of their replacement as Athena/Minerva's bird by the owl. I mentioned the crow and the owl to demonstrate how Ovid emulates Callimachus's storytelling style. Both poems are presented as epic, foundational tales about Athens, and both subvert our expectations by honing in on specific details that are apparently unrelated to the main narrative, and as animal fables in the midst of epic, somewhat generically transgressive. Ovid's take on the story of Erichthonius in the basket is unexpected for its transmission through the internal narrator of the crow and its loosely connected digressions. But when we consider the lines depicting the Cecropid myth, we see that Ovid knew all of the variants of the transmitted story if he only directly provides one. So this is especially apparent in the description of the baby in the basket once it's revealed. And I have this line on the next slide. They, meaning the Cecropids, see a baby and stretched alongside it a snake. We can recall the very description of Erichthonius as a baby, a snake, and a mix between the two. The crow's wording in this line seems to suggest that there are two occupants in the basket, a baby and a snake, evoking the myth transmitted in, for example, Euripides' Ion, where the snake acts as the baby's guardian. But considering the participle ad correctum, which comes from the verb porrigo, which in Ovid is often used to describe a person or an animal stretching their own limbs, like stretching their hands toward the sky, it seems that the snake may be an extension of the baby, its own limb. Moreover, the word order creates an iconic word picture, the verbal equivalent of a drawing of a half baby, half snake. At the front of the line, we see infantem, the baby, and at the end, as if at the other side of the basket, draconem, the snake. The polar distance between the words infantem and draconem exemplifies the stark opposition between the two parts of the body, an innocent, helpless baby and a potentially deadly monster. Finally, the postponement of draconem to the end of the line heightens the drama when the mystery of the basket's contents is finally revealed in all its bizarreness. This scene, as Ovid tells it, became a popular subject for Renaissance painting. And on the next slide, we'll see Peter Paul Rubens' 17th century painting of the event, which I think is great. And you can see the snake wrapped around the baby in the basket. And then there's, on the next slide, another 17th century painting, which I also really like because there's a lot going on in the painting, and it kind of takes a moment to notice that the baby's legs sort of end in a snake. And it's kind of like the painting equivalent of postponing the word draconem. So, such is Ovid's myth of the Cecropids and baby Erichthonius. The crow's story doesn't include the usually transmitted punishment to befall the Cecropids, the death by cliff fall. Instead, we learn about the crow's lost status as Minerva's favorite bird before the narrator moves on to other things. We might assume at this point that this is all we will hear of Athens' founding family in the Metamorphoses, but Ovid takes up the thread again about 200 lines later, this time without the aid of an internal narrator. It's possible that Ovid's unusual take on the next portion of the myth was influenced by parts of Callimachus's Hecale that have not survived, and possible that what we see next is Ovid's own innovation. When the tale resumes, Mercury is flying over Attica when he spots a procession of girls carrying baskets toward the Parthenon. He falls in love with one of them, and it's Herse. At this point, we find ourselves no longer in an epic, but in a sort of Menandrian comedy, as Mercury is kept out of Herse's bedroom by her sister, Aglaros, who demands gold in exchange for his access. Defying the forceful reputation of gods established in stories like that of Daphne and Io in Metamorphoses Book 1, Mercury agrees, and he flies away for the time being to get gold. At this point, Minerva notices what's going on and that the sister who had transgressed against her is now on the verge of allowing Mercury access to one of her castae puellae, chaste girls. So Minerva travels to an underworld type place and fetches a fury-like creature named Invidia. Invidia finds Aglaros in her bed and infects her with envy, from which point she becomes the ultimate anti-elegiac heroine. She considers ruining the imminent affair by telling her father about it, and settles herself again in the doorway, acting as her sister's janitor in an epic pericles of her own. When she refuses to move, Mercury, unflustered, turns Aglaros to stone. This entire chapter of the myth is pretty much unprecedented and full of delightful details that can be and have been analyzed. NVIDIA in particular is a fascinating invention and one focus of my dissertation. But what I want to focus on now are the 3 lines that occur right when the Cecropids' tale resumes, describing the ritual procession that catches Mercury's attention. And I have the 3 lines on the next slide. This means on that day, by chance, chaste girls, according to custom, were carrying pure sacred items in garlanded baskets atop their heads, atop their necks, into the celebrating citadel of Pallas Minerva. These lines particularly command my attention because they have lent themselves to a quiet controversy. What procession exactly is Mercury spying on? The ritual arophoria, as we've seen, is connected with Cecropids in art and literature before and after Ovid. A handful of scholars have brought this connection to bear on Ovid's text. In the same book where we read the myth of Erichthonius, it is only reasonable to find its ritual counterpart, the arophoria. This is the take by Noel Robertson in his thorough article on what he calls the riddle of the arophoria. In this article, he uses Ovid's scene as evidence for the particulars of the festival. On the other hand, both major commentaries on this book by Boehmer and Barchiesi identify the procession as that of the Panathenaea, perhaps the most well-known Athenian festival. In the remainder of my time, I'd like to appraise both options to see which festival, if either, is the right fit for Ovid's procession scene. At the same time, I'll address the question of whether or not the narrator presents this festival as the first of its kind, which would make it another ideology. It is worthwhile to briefly outline the 2 festivals in order to understand the fundamental differences between them. And useful here is a much discussed passage from Aristophanes' Lysistrata, where the chorus of women describe their service to the city in various festivals from childhood on. The first festival they took part in was the arophoria. Appropriately, the festival participants are said to be children, either 2 or sometimes 4 girls aged from 7 to 11. The fourth and last festival that the chorus mentions is generally interpreted as the Greater Panathenaea, where the chorus acts as basket bearers, coniphore, now as beautiful young women. The Panathenaea was the more impressive of the 2 festivals, involving the entire city in celebrations and sacrifices. The crowning moment of the festival was the delivery of the completed cloak, the peplos, to Athena on the Acropolis. Both festivals, the arophoria and the Panathenaea, seem to have occurred in the summer. Both are in honor of Athena, and both include ritual processions of basket-bearing girls. Let us consider the merits of each festival for identification in Ovid's scene. The Greater Panathenaea has the benefit of being very well known. Although occurring only every 4 years, it was an enormous festival that was well documented in literature and art. The arophoria, in contrast, was obscure. We saw that it seemed novel to Pausanias, writing 100 years later. We have no way of knowing whether Ovid was aware of the arophoria festival, but it can be fairly confidently asserted that he knew about the Panathenaea. There's also the fact that Ovid's description of the procession seems to include more than 2 girls. The arophoria generally had 2 girls, it's thought. And on the next slide, we have this description of Herse from Mercury's focal point. And it says, as much as the morning star outshines the rest, as much as the moon outshines the morning star, by this much did Herse stand out among the other girls. She was the glory of the procession of her companions. The basket carriers of the Panathenaea were many. The basket carriers of the arophoria were 2 or maybe 4. So this makes it more likely that we have the Panathenaea here. Then there's the issue of age. The Parthenoi at the Panathenaea were teenagers around marriageable age, but the girls in the arophoria were age 7 to 11. Herse's age isn't apparent in Ovid's description of her, but the fact that Mercury falls in love with her suggests that she's nubile, probably older. In an article on Ovid's Attic cycle, Gildenhart and Zissos point out that this moment of love at first sight is a generic slippage based on the trope in late Attic comedy, where men fall in love with women during ritual processions in Athens, because that is one of the few times that women were prominently visible in public life. The arophoria wouldn't have worked in this setting because it happened at night and probably would not have attracted oglers in the same way. One other piece of evidence that urges us toward the identification with the Panathenaea is not exactly clear-cut. The description of the girls in Ovid, once again, the introduction is, by chance, it was that day when chaste girls, according to custom, were carrying pure sacred items in garlanded baskets atop their necks into the celebrating citadel of Pallas Minerva. And I think I put that again on the next slide. I think I have like 4 slides with just those lines. Good. So this description has a visual counterpart in the Parthenon frieze, which I have on the next slide. This image has long been identified with the procession of basket carriers that accompany the delivery of the completed peplos to Athena at the Greater Panathenaea. This identification has occasionally been disputed and may never be resolutely settled. But regardless, we're not alone if we see a connection between the basket bearers on the Parthenon frieze and Ovid's basket bearers. Note the similarity of the girls' poses in this 17th century adaptation of Ovid's tale, which I have on the next slide. They're in an almost identical pose. There's really a similarity here. There's one issue with the identification of the Panathenaea that is addressed by both commentators, and that is anachronism. The Panathenaea was founded by Erichthonius after he grew into adult and became king of Athens. The last time we saw Erichthonius in Ovid's poem, he was a tiny snake baby. It is impossible for him to have grown up and founded the festival in the 200 intervening lines, since the Cecropids seem not to have aged. They're described as castai puellae, chaste girls. Both Boehmer and Barchiesi, in their commentaries, note the anachronism without a solution. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, time is notoriously plastic, so such an issue as this does not rule out the identification of the Panathenaea on its own. But it's worth noting that both commentators remark during the story of Erichthonius, the first passage we looked at, in the basket as the foundation myth for the ritual arophoria. Neither commentator brings up the arophoria in the procession scene, despite the anachronism issue with the Parthenaea. So such is the evidence for the Panathenaea identification. It is compelling, but not conclusive. On the other hand, we have the unavoidable fact that Ovid pairs the ritual procession with the myth of Erichthonius in the basket, historically correlated with the ritual of the arophoria. Both occur in Book 2, both feature the Cecropids. It would be very surprising if the procession were unrelated to the sacrilege reported by the crow, especially considering Ovid's established fondness for ideologies. In fact, Minerva compels us to connect the two events. When she sees Aglaros acting as procuress for her sister and demanding money from Mercury, she remembers the earlier transgression, and I've got these lines on the next slide. This is sort of the beginning of the second scene with the Cecropids, and we're repeatedly reminded of the earlier transgression of Aglaros by the narrator and then procularized from Minerva's viewpoint. So we as readers are compelled to keep the earlier offense in mind in the procession scene. A number of other textual echoes enforce the connection between the two scenes. And now we got to go to the next slide. Bless you. So here we see the basket given to the Cecropids is called the Acteo Texta de Vimine Kista, a basket woven from Actaean twigs. The adjective Acteo refers to an Athenian king even older than Cecrops, for whom Athens was named up until the competition between Athena and Poseidon firmly established it as Athena's city. The adjective recurs when Mercury flies over the city, where Athens is metonymically the Actaeos Arches, Actaean citadel. This sort of unusual adjective for Athens compels us to put the two scenes together. Then there's the word kista, when we first see the basket, which is a Latinization of the Greek word kiste, which we see in Callimachus's Hecale in the same description, or the description of the same event. The kista holding Erichthonius is said to house Minerva's secreta. The baskets we see in the procession scene are described in a very similar way, holding pura sacra. Also, both the basket holding Erichthonius and the baskets in the procession scene are elaborately adorned. Aglaros must untie knots, nodos, to see the baby inside in the first scene. And in the second scene, we see that the baskets, canistra, are garlanded, coronatis. The word canistrum is basically synonymous with kista, also referring to a woven basket, though this word has particularly ceremonial connotations. This makes sense as we see Aglaros's transgression made sacred. The regular basket becomes a sacred basket. The knots tying it close become ritual garlands. The Arophoria festival is a ritual procession of Parthenoi and was associated with the Cecropids long before the Metamorphoses. It's apparent from the many intertextual connections between the two scenes that Ovid wants us to connect the transgression with the ritual procession depicted. The transgression is already connected with the Arophoria ritual, so it is a reasonable conclusion that the festival procession we're seeing here is the Arophoria. One final consideration should be taken into account when viewing the procession as the arophoria, and that is etymology. I mentioned earlier that the first part of the word arophoria is thought to come from the word areta, meaning things that cannot be spoken. This etymology is uncertain. Ancient inscriptions and lexicographers list variant spellings of the festival as arophoria, ersiphoria, and hersiphoria, the last of which is clearly connected to the name Herse. The variant spellings of the festival are attested on ancient inscriptions that predate Ovid, and the folk etymology is found in an Alexandrian scholia to the Lysistrata. One suggestion is that Herse, the only sister without an altar or sanctuary on the Acropolis, was a later addition to the myth, whose name was derived from the festival name and or as a synonym for her sister's name, Pandrosos. Another possibility is that the festival was originally named after Dew and Herse, and the name changed over time, eventually being replaced with Areta as the folk etymology. I'm not a linguist. Professor Naj has told me that the name of the festival is opaque, and I accept his expertise. I have no interest in proving that the Araphoria festival is named after Herse, but I do feel bold enough to suggest that Ovid could have known about this possible etymological relationship. Ovid uses folk etymologies all the time in his poetry, some of which are more convincing than others. This tendency is especially pronounced in his explicitly ideological poem, The Fasti, where we find many creative interpretations of, for example, the names of the months. But it isn't unheard of in the Metamorphoses either. It's possible that Ovid promoted Herse to a starring role in this story as a subtle nod to the festival's name, alternative name, Persephoria. It would also be quite clever and subtle move for Ovid to hint at the festival's etiology and etymology through Herse's name without explicitly saying it. We also recall the symbolic significance of dew in its connection to reproduction. It may not be a coincidence that one of the sisters whose name means dew is facing down a sexual union with Mercury. The occasional interpretation of the Araphoria as an initiation ritual, symbolizing girls' transitions from childhood to marriage and childrearing, becomes relevant. In some versions of the myth, in fact, Herse and Mercury do get married, and they have a child called Carex, whose descendants presided over the Eleusinian mysteries. Noel Robertson makes one further connection with the Araphoria that's worth mentioning. We recall that the Araphoria had two stages. First, the girls descend into an underground area and deliver secret items. Then they pick up different secret items and return to the Acropolis. Robertson's theory has to do with the second set of secret items that the girls carry. It's Robertson's contention that the items carried out from the underground area are stones representing the baby Erichthonius, based on a number of myths where stones take the place of babies. Robertson interprets Aglaros's death and petrification in Ovid's version not as her turning to stone as in becoming a statue, but as her turning into a stone without the shape of her former self. The story, as Ovid tells it, then becomes the foundation for this portion of the Araphoria rite. In this way, Ovid sneakily reveals the contents of the basket in the Araphoria ritual as a stone that used to be Aglaros and represents Erichthonius without openly transgressing against the mysteries and flat out stating what's in the baskets. I find this argument intriguing, if not entirely convincing. The main issue for me is that the symbolism of the stone seems overburdened, which comes to represent the baby Erichthonius and the ritual transgressor Aglaros at the same time. I do think it's reasonable that whatever was in the basket that the Araphoria carried out stood for the baby Erichthonius, which they don't look at. But the rest of the interpretation, I think, is difficult to prove. It's also likely from the wording in the Metamorphoses that Aglaros becomes a statue and not just a stone. She's called a Saxon and a Lapis, both of which mean stone, but also a Signum exsangue, bloodless statue. And Signum is used in the Metamorphoses to mean a statue. Notably, Robert Parker, in his book Polytheism and Society, says that statues of Araphorae have been identified by their inscriptions from the 3rd century BC onwards. If Aglaros's transformed statue body is the origin of anything, it seems more likely to me that it would be such a dedicatory statue as this. And on the next slide, I have an inscription on the base of one such statue, and I unfortunately couldn't find an image of the base or the statue, but it seems to have been devoted on behalf of a real girl who performed the rites of the Araphoros. The statue is dedicated to Athena and to Pandrosus. So it's possible there were statues of Araphorae lying around, and that might have been why Aglaros turned to stone, but that's all kind of uncertain. So such is the evidence for an identification of the procession with the Araphoria. Like for the Panathenaia, it's compelling but hardly indisputable. There is one more festival that is relevant to this scene that is worth mentioning, and that's the Plinteria. This festival was ostensibly in honor of Aglaros in compensation for her death, according to ancient lexicographers like Hesychius. A festival established for her death is necessarily relevant to a scene which depicts her death, like we have here in the Metamorphoses. But it's hard to reconcile the procession scene with the Plinteria, which involved not basket bearers, but girls who carried a wooden statue of Athena to the river for cleaning. So 3 Attic festivals come to mind when reading this scene of the Metamorphoses, and all 3 have some relevance to the characters and the events. The Panathenaia and the Araphoria in particular suit the description of the procession, since both include processions of basket-bearing girls. The establishment of both festivals and myth are associated with the characters we've been dealing with. The Auraphoria is performed in compensation for the Cecropids' transgression, and Erichthonius himself founded the Panathenaea. It may follow then that whichever festival we're viewing is the first of its kind. The mystery deepens, and a possible solution presents itself when we examine the procession scene as an ideology. We saw in Ovid's cryptic descriptions of the baby Erichthonius in the basket that ideologies can be subtle, but they can also be obvious. In a book called Ovid's Causes by K. Sarah Myers, the author examines the poetics of Ovid's ideologies and delineates two types in the Metamorphoses, natural and cultural. Natural would explain something like the cliff face that Niobe turns into in Book 6, and a cultural ideology, an example of that would be the founding of the Pythian Games by Apollo in Book 1. The founding of either the Auraphoria or the Panathenaea would count as the cultural ideology in this dichotomy. So let's compare our lines of the procession with the foundation of the Pythian Games, which is really the first cultural ideology in the book, in the poem, which I have on the next slide. So here we read, he, meaning Apollo, established the sacred games with a celebrated competition called after the Pythian name of the conquered serpent. So it's somewhat cryptic. You would have to have heard of the Pythian Games to understand what the Pythian name of the conquered serpent means. So Apollo killed a python and then founded these games. But it's also pretty clear that what we're looking at is an ideology by words like instituit, he established, and the word dictos, meaning it's named after. Words relating to establishing or founding are often used in Ovidian ideologies, as well as phrases that connect the past with the present, like nunc quoque, now too. In the procession scene, however, we get a different formula, which I have the lines again on the next slide, de more, which means according to the custom. Boehmer in his commentary singles out this expression as high poetic language. Elsewhere in the Metamorphoses, the phrase de more is used to refer to already established rituals. For example, in Book 7, we read about a plague, the victims of which were not buried with the usual rites, since there were too many bodies for the city to accommodate. The usual funeral rites, here ignored, are described as de more, according to the custom. The usage of de more to refer to an already established ritual act is consistent in Ovid's poem, leading me to the conclusion that the phrase indicates that this ritual procession is part of an already established ritual and not a straightforward ideology. Nevertheless, I suspect there is an ideological element to Ovid's myth of the Cecropids. Just as the poet nodded to variants of the story in the presentations of the baby in the basket, I suspect Ovid is allowing for the possibility of several variants here. At the very least, we can say that the two Cecropid scenes established the ritual of basket bearing in Athenian festivals. Basket bearing girls, according to Robert Parker, were a component of all sacrificial processions, not just the two festivals we've been discussing. The procession scene in Ovid is likely meant to evoke images of the Panathenaea in our mind for its ubiquity in ancient thought, and because the teenage girls in the procession better suit Ovid's elegiac farce with Mercury and Herse. But elements of the Auraphoria are undoubtedly evident as well. The folk etymology of the festival connected with the name Herse, who Ovid promotes from transgressor to the elegiac heroine of the episode. And then there are the similarities in the depictions of the baskets with their mysterious contents in the two episodes. It makes it inevitable that we as readers will connect the two scenes. It's therefore my conclusion that Ovid's procession is vague enough to be loosely identified with the Panathenaea without incurring charges of anachronism. At the same time, Ovid allows for those readers who are aware of the lesser known festival and its origins to see this procession as the ritual correction of the first Cecropid scene. The subtlety of the ideologies in the Attic cycle are apparently by design. Gildenhart and Zissos remark that, quote, the exclusion of meaningful ideological elements is a systematic and pervasive strategy. The narrator obscures, compresses, and elides crucial legendary material so severely that it would be difficult to infer that the events described had any foundational significance whatsoever for Athens. In the Kallimachian style, our expectations are repeatedly subverted by the narrator's spotlight, which shifts from subject to subject in innovative and elusive ways. Ovid's ideologies are sometimes difficult, sometimes straightforward. Either way, a single read through any portion of the poem will rarely reveal all the subtleties woven into the lines. The Attic cycle in Book 2 of Ovid's Metamorphoses is layered and complex, and will not reveal its secrets without the untying of some knots. The deferment of the sister's death by cliff fall, replaced by a comically unsuccessful elegiac scene, complete with elements of horror in the pseudo-fury in Vidia, demonstrate Ovid's tremendous creativity and generic innovation. Where we have Kallimachian origins for his choices, things are a bit clearer, like in the story of the crow. But in the presentation of the procession of Parthenoi, Ovid offers up more questions than answers. The identification of this procession with a single festival is not easily settled, and it seems to me may ask the wrong questions. At best, we can say with confidence that the procession depicts the already established ritual of basket bearing, which was a feature of both the Panathenaea and the Auraphoria. Ovid therefore offers two equally balanced sides to the same phenomenon, the mythical transgressions and the ritual connection, while allowing the reader to make connections with either festival. Thank you. On my last slide, I have just a bibliography if anyone's curious about that. I'm going to take a breath.
Thank you. You deserve it after all of that.
It was faster than when I practiced it, so I'm sorry if I was rushing.
No, it was all very intelligible.
Good.
Thanks for the bibliography. That's very useful. I will be consulting that. Good. All right, well, that's up on the screen and people can look at that later. I will see if I can bring us back. For Q&A time. Thanks again, Miriam. That was wonderful and fascinating. And does anyone have any questions? Maria, go right ahead.
Okay. Well, Miriam, thank you very much. That was fascinating and extremely informative, because I think you included all things possible, and you took into account inscriptional sources, literary sources, and you combined them extremely well. What I would like not to ask you, just to tell us more about the possibility of Ovid having this, what we may call folklore knowledge through inscriptions, or for example, some other knowledge that has been lost to us, probably via the Alexandrian scholars and so on. I mean, do you have any more information about this, or do you think that all this is conjectural and leads us to a dead end?
Thank you. That's a great question. There's, it can be very frustrating when you feel like you've met a dead end with sort of what were Ovid's sources, what myth is he talking about here, and that's something I've run into in this research. And I definitely didn't answer all the questions that come up. Sort of like, why does she turn to stone at the end? I don't really know. So I think there are definitely things that Ovid knows that we can't know. Like most of the Hekale, which seems to be his source for this Attic cycle, is gone. The best we can do is hope that some papyri shows up someday. But then you can sort of take the interesting approach of what does Ovid seem to be hinting at once you get used to his style of hinting.
Yes.
And then you can kind of work backwards and piece together what might have been his sources. I think there's more work to be done in that direction on this particular scene, which maybe I'll do. At this point. Yeah, I just know there's more that I don't understand, and that's the best I can do.
Have you tracked down any incongruities between what the early sources, both inscriptional or literary or oral, which were written down after all, are telling us, and how, in a way, Ovid forged them into his own narrative? Or again, this is something, I mean, Ovid just gives us his own narrative and that's it?
Well, there are definitely incongruities. So the most striking of which is that the Cecropids shouldn't be alive after the Erythonius scene. It's bizarre that they're alive. And it kind of undercuts the takeaway of that scene, which is that you shouldn't look in the basket. The goddess tells you not to. You shouldn't transgress the rules of the mysteries. If they don't die, that moral is less clear. It becomes more muddied as we sort of go through this rather long kind of elegiac story where Aglaros ultimately is punished, but it's just not as straightforward. So that incongruity, I think, could be better explained. There are some opinions on sort of what Ovid is doing throughout this book, and there are a couple of places where he seems to be hinting at Roman conventions amidst the discussion of Greek stories. And And there might be this sort of undercurrent of Romanitas throughout that contributes to the sort of undercutting of Athenian myths. I don't have all that worked out in my head yet, but it's a possibility.
I just asked about the congruities because you are the expert and you studied all sources before you end up to your conclusion. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm a philologist, so this foray into inscriptions was and art was a stretch for me. So I hope it worked.
If I may.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Hi, Miriam. That's wonderful. As far as I can tell, you've covered the waterfront on what Ovid's possible sources that are available to us go. But I'm fascinated that he throws so many aspects of Attic legend together that Callimachus had thrown together that don't have a really strong logical nexus, but you have these image connections of the snakes, the anguiform humans, not least the Asclepius. That Asclepius and Coronis are brought in here, and the birds. What there are so many sort of teasing image connections. It seems to me that the whole second book of the Metamorphoses really kind of needs to be turned inside out, or what are the connections, and how does it work intertextually with Callimachus's Hecale and Euripides' Ion and other things that he was obviously aware of.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. I'm eternally fascinated by it because I don't really understand it. So there are so many snakes in this book, and so there's the story of Asclepius, who's symbolized with a snake in between these two scenes we're looking at, in between the first and second Cecropid scene, and then the Fury, or who I call a Fury, she's sort of a malevolent personification in Vidia. She's eating snakes when we first see her, and she seems to be poisonous and noxious like a snake. She's fascinating. But the Asclepius story is an example of what people sometimes call this analogous substitution that Ovid does, where he sort of sets us up to expect a certain story and then tells us a similar one, but not the one we expected. So we think this is what some people have argued, that we see Erichthonius as a baby and we're expecting to learn about his upbringing, because there were myths about that and eventually his foundation of the Panathenaia. But instead we get Asclepius. It's sort of like, okay, that's kind of similar, but not what I thought I was going to get. And one argument about that sort of replacement is that Asclepius is a Roman deity too. He was adopted by the Romans. And so Ovid is kind of saying, well, autochthony is cool, but it's also okay if your gods are imported from elsewhere. And maybe for a Roman, Asclepius was more interesting, more valuable in some way than the childhood of Erichthonius. As for making sense of all the snakes and all the birds, I'm still thinking about it. There's so much there.
Yeah, that's so maybe there's an association there. So while we're talking about snakes, well, Asclepius, who came to Rome and saved Rome, he turned into a snake too. So it's kind of a loose connection, perhaps.
Yeah, it's like I'm sort of waiting for a puzzle piece to fall into place and make it all make sense to me. And I've been waiting for many years and it hasn't happened yet.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
For that wonderful presentation.
Sarah, go ahead.
Miriam, I'd just like to pick up on one thing that you mentioned when you were talking about Mercury falling in love with the girls and said, but it happens at night. And I was thinking about how Hermes, in Greek mythology at least, he can be nocturnal. He brings sleep to mortals. He guides souls through to Hades. He guides Priam at night and so on. So I wonder if that isn't actually I don't know whether that applies to the Roman Mercury, and Ovid would have thought that way, but maybe it isn't such a no deal.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really excellent point. There's even, when we first see Mercury, he sort of floats down like a bird, another bird, to spy on the girls, and then he sort of makes himself pretty, and he's got his wand, and it's described as being able to give and take away sleep. So this idea, this association of Mercury and sleep is definitely at the front of our minds. So that's interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Ray Eugenia.
And following up with what Sarah has said, Mercury, I think, implies the possibility of a transformation from the state of humans to gods. So why is he in love with the sister who is in the middle in age, but Herse is in the middle. She has, for me, the possibility to go from one place to another one, but in related to the mystery of or the initiation, because at the end of that story, Ovid says that it was her full happiness, as if she has been initiated and accomplished all the mystery that causes the envy of Aglarus. And then as Aglarus was turned into stone, Herse has a transformation, but a more subtle or more spiritual. I mean, I think it is interesting to see it in that way, the inclusion of Mercury and Herse as a middle place in which you can morph into something. You can accomplish a mystery, or you can go even or violate, not going down, but going to the gods, something like that. I don't know if I am reading into the text, but I think the inclusion of Mercury and Herse as a middle, as it is a middle place, and finishing with a full happiness tells us something about the accomplishment of the mystery. I don't know.
No, you're right. That's a really interesting point. Mercury definitely has this liminal quality as the god who goes back and forth between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And then we know initiation rituals have the same liminal qualities. You transition from one phase of life to another. And you're right that Herse is I'm not sure about their ages relative to one another, but Herse is depicted as in the middle physically. Their bedrooms are described. I think that's what you're referring to. And her bedroom is Aglaros is on the left, obviously, because she's evil. Pandrosus is on the right, and Herse's in the middle. So she exemplifies this liminality. It is a really good point. That's great. Thank you.
Potentially of morphine upwards. I don't know if the word is correct. That Mercury has or offers to man.
Yeah, I think that's there. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Can I ask something, please? Okay, thank you. It's probably not a question really. It's more of a feeling I have of slight unease. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed what you said. I'm just wondering whether Ovid is more of a source for Ovid and his life and times and contexts than he is as a source about ancient Greece. And I think the reason I say that is a while back, the book club here, we read the Aeneid, And the Aeneid, when we were analysing it, seems so much about what Virgil's life and circumstances. And I'm just wondering if the same is true of Ovid, that there was some kind of an agenda there that was to do with his life and his context.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point. I never want to sort of look at poetry in a vacuum. I think it's generally a mistake, as you're suggesting. And I think that's there's this one article that was really influential for me about the riddle of the Araphoria, and it sort of takes this interesting approach of looking at Ovid as evidence for the festival, which I think is actually not the right approach. I don't think we should try to reconstruct ancient Greece from Ovid's depiction of it. I think we can take what we know about ancient Greece from other sources and let that inform our reading of Ovid. And that's what I want to do, and try to understand what he's doing and why he included this procession scene at all, if it's so sort of vague and unspecified. And as for sort of historical context, I think I'm still, this is something I've been mulling over, and a lot of these questions have sort of brought it back to the forefront of my mind, which is, how does Ovid feel about Athens? And what does his depiction of Athens tell us about his opinion of it as a Roman in the beginning of the Roman Empire? And there's a line in Pausanias 100 years after Ovid. He says that under Sulla, Athens really crumbled and it didn't come back to its cultural heights until Hadrian. So at this time, Athens was not exactly the splendid place we imagine. No. And it's hard for me to know exactly what a Roman attitude toward Athens would be at this time. And I think I need to do more research on it. So thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Bill. I was wondering about initiation rites related to Aglarus. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so Aglaros also had a temenos, like a temple altar sanctuary on the Acropolis. And she seems to have been involved in this thing called the Oath of the Ephebe. So this is a ritual for boys, sort of an initiation ritual for boys. And I haven't exactly worked out how that fits in with the myth, but because there are further myths about Aglaros that are kind of cryptic. She seems to have become a goddess at a certain point and married Ares at a certain point. So she is associated with war, with men in this way. It's a really good question. And it's something that I need to look more into, and that will probably color my interpretation of this scene in a more nuanced way.
I've been reading Graves. Forgive Anne and I were big fans. He suggests there's another myth where attacking army. So as usual, a princess has to jump off the cliff. Yeah. And that's the connection there between young men initiating into the military.
Yeah, there's sort of confusion between these two Athenian kings, Erichthonius and then Erechtheus. And there's a play by Euripides, it's fragmentary, called Erechtheus, where he sacrifices his daughter for the sake of winning a war. So this sacrifice of the young girl is a recurring motif. And there is confusion about who's whose parents and who's whose child. It's kind of a tangled knot to me at this time, and something I hope to unweave.
So their mother's name?
The mother's name is also Aglarosia.
So that could confuse the issue even more.
Yeah, I'm extremely confused.
Glad I could help.
Appreciate it. So the wife of Cecrops is also said to be named Aglaros or Agralos with the R and the L switched. Maybe she was the wife first, and then the myth about the daughters took off, so we put the name there. It's all hard to untangle.
Yeah. Well, don't you think a lot of Ovid's the structuring of his story and the way he moves through these narratives is sort of in dialogue with Callimachus and the elegists who had invoked Callimachus as a great role model. When he says about that he's going to sing a Carmen continuum, that was just directly saying, I'm going to do what Callimachus said he was criticized for not doing. And so there's so much of the idea, the elegiac, the 4-book books of elegies in the way he moves us through associations from one icon to another. Yeah, I think we always need to be watching, where is the Kalamachian twist in the story, and as you say, with the hints, like the rituals that are a little bit off color or not exactly in tune with what is being done in the rest of the world. And the thing about the stones, maybe that itself, is sort of explaining why is Athens so rocky.
Yeah, that's a thought. So there's another part of the myth that Ovid doesn't report, where when Athena Minerva finds out what the girls did, she's holding a mountain and then she drops it, and that's the explanation for one of the mountains in the Athenian landscape. So someone has suggested, and now I can't remember who, that's the rock that Aglaros becomes. Why not? Seems to me she's a statue, but I think that's definitely worth considering. And as for Ovid's relationship with Callimachus, it's complicated. There's the book I mentioned called Ovid's Causes by someone called Myers has been very helpful to me in sort of untangling the ambivalent relationship between Ovid and his, the sort of anxiety of influence that we see at play there, where he's very Callimachian at times and then very anti-Callimachian at times.
Lynn, I saw that you had a question.
Yes, I had a question about the second article that was part of the suggested readings for your very interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Miriam. It was really great. Well, it's about the two verbs, the Greek verbs, pherein and again, in reference to the carrying of ritual objects or leading. Could you tell us a little bit more about the different aspects of the rituals concerned with this, in relation with these two verbs, graphein and again?
The verbs again and, sorry, what was the second word?
Yeah. Yes.
Pherein.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
So there's a word that's used sort of regardless of the festival to describe this procession of basket bearers. It's konephori, so literally basket bearers, and it seems to have been. I don't know the historical origin of the ritual, although I suspect that the story of looking in the basket is the mythical origin of the ritual. But girls carrying baskets with mysterious objects inside is an aspect of a number of Athenian festivals. And Robert Parker, who's one of the experts on Athenian festivals, says that it was actually involved in every sacrificial procession. And I'm not sure exactly which festivals involve sacrificial processions precisely, but it seems to have been a pretty common phenomenon throughout the calendar year. So this ritual carrying of baskets, which carry items that are ritually significant, is pretty ingrained in Athenian myth and ritual. And I think that it would have been one of the things that a Roman would know about Athenian myth and ritual, and that might be why Ovid chooses to highlight that aspect of an Athenian festival, is to sort of represent the Athenian festival. But I'm not sure I answered your question.
Well, part of it, yes, definitely. But yes,
I'll take it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
Hello, very interesting discussion. Just going from the discussion of words and rituals, I'm just struck by how the juxtaposition of the ritual elements, which seem to be the same here in Athenian society as they are in the most primitive Amazonian tribes, which I studied, bearing secret objects from one place to another, groups of initiates, being transformed. And yet here's a society that developed philosophy, history, medicine. It's such an interesting juxtaposition that you see the same ritual types that you would in a very, I can't use the word primitive, I guess, these days, but a hunter-gatherer society with a society that is also so far advanced.
That's really interesting to me, and I'd be curious to hear more about what you study in particular. I'm not an anthropologist, and I've read bits of the Golden Bough and these things, and I'm not sure and I think that the idea that sort of all human societies began in this primitive way and then went to this sort of cultured place is a little bit too sort of glosses over a lot of the nuances. I would be curious to know more about the specific rituals, Amazonian rituals that you're mentioning, to see what sort of similarities we can glean and what that might mean, if that can tell us anything more about the Athenian festivals that remain a bit mysterious to us. But I'll say I'm pretty ignorant on that subject.
Okay, well, basically I'm referring to the Jay Amazonian Indians. I was thinking of a specific ritual where young boys recently initiated go into the forest. The men then shoot arrows into the forest. The boys then take these arrows, gather them, and bring them back into the village, sort of a juxtaposition of nature and culture. And then later attempt to enter all of the huts of the villagers wearing masks. Not that it has any relationship to your ritual, but it's these ritual objects of transferring nature to culture, as part of an initiation.
Wow, that's so interesting. That's really cool. I'd never heard of that. I think, so is it a sort of initiation into adulthood for boys?
Yes, it's
Wow.
part of that, yes.
Cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Professor Naj has done some work on sort of initiations into adulthood in various cultures, and there do seem to be some remarkable continuities. And it seems like it's kind of natural for humans to be curious about that transition. And even though it's in reality a gradual transition, to want to ceremonialize it in some way. That's about all I'm willing to say on it right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On the subject of wide-ranging comparisons, there's a comment on YouTube from someone watching that the Celtic Grail procession is similar to Pausanias 127.3, and I don't have any more details about that.
Well, I will have to
but that's
look into
for
it.
further study.
Okay, I guess I'm going to be an anthropologist after this.
You can't avoid it. Well, our time is about up. So,
well, just if I may, Keith, I was just thinking that snakes, are special in a lot of Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures. In the story of Gilgamesh in the Old Testament, and they are considered, a symbol of wisdom as well as of other things. And I think besides the poisonous aspect of some of them, there's the thing about shedding their skin and rebirth that, gives them, I think, a special place in legend and myth.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I definitely see a sort of intuitive connection there between the shedding of skin and initiations from one phase of life to another. It's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jack. As a Hebrew Bible person, I have to thank you for bringing that in. All right. Well, thank you again, Miriam.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. See you soon for the next installment.